Hey, what's going on, everyone? So you read the title already, you have a good idea what I'm going to talk about here, but I am going to be using Ryzen for my daily editing gaming PC. This is the system behind me. I expect a few things will change. I build PCs and tear them down like the next week, and I still have Walter White 3, by the way. That one's not destroyed yet. It's still a good functioning PC, but there are some impracticalities involved with X299, and I haven't been silent about that. I think that the platform is extremely overpriced. I think that some of their CPUs don't even make sense or should not exist, but even though I had the i9-7900X in Walter White 3, I'm going to be personally using the Ryzen 1700X because I think it's a much more practical CPU, and I want to kind of set the example, not necessarily that people are looking up to me, but I think that if I'm going to promote the best price to performance CPU on the market, or a group of CPUs that are decent for the money, then I should be using those myself. And that's why I've been using an i7-6700K for so long. That CPU was great for me, and I've had a 5820K, a 6900K, a lot of CPUs that are just higher core counts, maybe higher frequencies, what have you. But I've just been very comfortable with an i7 because I feel like that's all I need for what I do. So I'm not going to just show off an i9-7900X and say, hey, check this out, I've got the CPU. Oh, by the way, it makes no sense, but I'm going to use it anyway. That's not what I want the channel to be about. I want it to be about the best bang for the buck. That's what I founded the channel on, and I think that Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5, for that matter, are excellent choices for those who are budget conscious, but at the same time, who want the most for their money, who want the most power that they can get for what they're paying. The Ryzen 7 1700 is right now the best performance per dollar Ryzen 7 CPU, only because you don't really get an extra 500 megahertz of overclocking headroom with the 1800X. It just doesn't happen. You'd be lucky if you get a well-binned 1800X that'll get you to 4.1, 4.2 gigahertz. Good luck. I'd say 1 or 2% of you will get that decent of an overclock and be able to keep it cool enough with like a 240 mil AIO, something along those lines. And even with this custom cooler here and my Ryzen 7 1700X, I can barely hit 4 gigahertz, and that's with a whopping 1.45 volts. That's a lot of voltage. AMD recommends around 1.35. They say anything above that, they're not really recommending. So in order to keep the voltage under control, if I want this to last me in the long run and not have to worry too much about the CPU failing, I've kept this one at 1.37 volts and 3.8 gigahertz, I think. 3.9 gigahertz, it was cool in Cinebench, failed in IDA64, so it'll probably fail in video rendering too. So 3.8 right now. Again, the motherboard can handle much higher than that, but it really just comes down to the CPU, how well binned it is. Mine's not that great, but 3.8 gigahertz across 8 cores and 16 threads is pretty solid. And like I said, I didn't build this system only for gaming. In fact, I probably video edit more than I play video games, just because I don't have a lot of time to do the latter. So I think that this chip right here is going to serve me very well. It is an upgrade from the i7-6700K from a video editing standpoint. The 8 cores are phenomenal in video editing. I do get a marginal decrease in rendering time for a 5-minute 1080p 60 FPS video file. I always show the same file and the same rendering time, so you can see across the board here which CPU is the best by far. And when you consider the price of the 1700, or in this case the 1700X, it is the better buy for content creators over the i7-6700K. Now in terms of gaming, there's nothing wrong with gaming on a Ryzen 7 CPU. I'll say that up front. The frame rate drop that I've experienced converting from the i7 to R7 is rather marginal, about maybe a 10-15 FPS delta, or in 1440p. Expect that to be a bit more in 1080p because it's a little more CPU intensive, and then IPC starts to really take hold there. A lot of games are still relying on primarily 4 cores, so having the extra 4 is just future-proofing at this point. Although we've been saying that since Bulldozer, that's an entirely different argument. But the marginal FPS delta is nowhere near enough to make me regret switching from the i7 to Ryzen 7. It's just an all-around better CPU, and especially for the price. I would say though that a few select titles are still preferring SMT be disabled. That's essentially the hyper-threading equivalent for Ryzen, that's simultaneous multi-threading. So instead of just having 8 physical cores, you have 8 cores and 16 threads. More about hyper-threading. SMT is kind of the same way in this video right here. So Black Ops 3 is one game that I've noticed that experiences rather infrequent FPS drops in the middle of gaming. So I'll hover around 150, 160 FPS in 1440p max settings with the two 1080s in here. And then if I I don't know, do something that's pretty intensive on the CPU side, some kind of physics aspect of the game, an explosion maybe, particles, whatnot. If you get into a place where it's pretty heavy on the CPU, it will drop immediately down to maybe 50, 60 FPS and then spike right back up to the consistent 130, 150, you know, around there. And I found that if I disable SMT, I don't have any spikes, any drops whatsoever. It's very consistent. And that just comes down to optimization. The developers haven't really adjusted yet to the new Ryzen architecture. Very complicated technical things that are honestly beyond me going to play that cause those spikes. But I would say that in most titles, you're going to be just fine. Black Ops 3 is an exception. It's just one that I've noticed, so if you do play a game like that, I would check forums. That's where I found out that that was what was causing my random spikes and well, I say spikes, but random dips in FPS. Just check those. If you play maybe 2 or 3 games and you want to switch to Ryzen, that could be something worth considering, disabling SMT. And if all you do is play games and that's what you would get, just a more consistent frame rate, then it's worth disabling. But for the most part, like I keep saying, you're going to be okay if you just leave it as is. Maybe give yourself a solid overclock, and you should be good to go. Other than that, I'm very happy with the build. It's not primed yet. I don't know if you can hear like the fluid churning, and there's some air bubbles still in the radiator, so I need to flip the PC around a bit, let that thing prime, and then it should be a bit quieter. But the build looks, I think it looks solid considering I built this in like a day and a half. I mean, I just kind of scrapped it together last minute because I wanted to make the point that you don't need a $1,000 CPU to be comfortable editing, content creating, and playing video games at the same time. Ryzen 7 and even I would argue Ryzen 5, those are both excellent CPU lineups for just an all-around computer enthusiast. And that's why I'm going to be using the 1700X as my daily driver. Of course, with 2 1080s in there, that's a bit overkill, but I would say a single 1070, 1080, or 1080 Ti will do you just fine in most resolutions. With that, if you like this video, or at least appreciate the honesty and switch, be sure to give this one a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Give it a thumbs down if you feel the complete opposite. Be sure to click the subscribe button if you haven't already, and stay tuned for, I have an interesting experiment coming up. Something happened to one of my 1080 Ti's. It keeps overheating. It gets extremely hot immediately under load, and I know for a fact that that water block is on there as it should be. So I think I'm going to remove the water block, put the air cooler back on, and see if we experience the same spikes. Could just be a PCB issue. We'll find out. This is Science Studio. Thanks for building with us.